Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel Gut Feel. Touching the feet of elders to seek their blessings is one of the nicer traditions in Hinduism, though it is now practiced by other communities too, maybe to a lesser extent. Of course, you rarely touch the feet. It's more the movement of bending and bowing low to show your respect. It is more prevalent in northern and central India, where some communities require the children to take their elders' blessings every morning. In South India, the practice is more or less reserved for special religious or social occasions or when visiting the temple. When seeking the blessings of elders, men generally perform the full-length prostration, that is the Shashtang Namaskar, while women are required to do the half version, the Panchang Namaskar. Personally, I follow the feet touching tradition with most elders, but I am embarrassed and uncomfortable when youngsters attempt to touch my feet. For one, it makes me feel old, and second, I know that I am ill qualified for the honor. My beloved late mother-in-law, a very progressive and forward-thinking lady, used to detest people making a show of touching her feet. Her favorite remark was, "पैर पड़ने के बहाने पैर खींच मत लेना." However, she never objected to my doing the Shashtang Namaskar to her. I guess that's because I had convinced her that I was a very good son-in-law. Jokes aside, in view of our professed Bharatiya Sanskar of treating elders with respect, feet touching is practiced in its various forms widely, and for the most part, it is done genuinely, except in the case of politicians. A political supporter is obliged and expected to touch the feet of his patron's politician when approaching him or her. The original gesture of respect becomes an ugly show of total loyalty. In other words, it is a demonstration and pledge of undying, unquestioning servility, flattery, and sycophancy. Every politician in India is constantly surrounded by his hangers-on and supporters, who carry out the feet-touching procedure at every opportunity. The hypocrisy and insincerity behind this practice is quite obvious to both the bender and the bendy. But it is a mandated ritual, and no sycophant worth his lycophancy will dare to forget it. Not doing what everyone else does would be to stand out like a sore thumb. And we know every politician will unhesitatingly cut off the thumb that dares to stick out. I also know that many of these chamchas that hang around them would rather stab that politician in the eye given half the chance, but feel obliged to stoop and do what is mandated. Much as I dislike the lack of self-respect in the supporters, I just loathe that look of benign patronage and benefaction that sweeps across a politician's face when somebody touches his feet. In fact, in many cases, the politician and the supporter are actually sworn enemies, and they know it, but the bending is done to concede temporary defeat and submission on the one hand, and signify subjugation and superiority on the other. But I do wonder what younger politicians feel when a supporter as old as him or her, or even older, feels obliged to touch his feet. Some of our politicians are quite young, like say Sachin Pilot or Jyotiraditya Scindia. I wonder why they allow their supporters, even those who are older to them, to touch their feet. We can see that repeatedly on TV. These young guys have had the benefit of good education exposure to the West, where this kind of gesture is unthinkable and would be considered gross. That was the exact word used by an American friend. What stops them from telling their supporters to cease and desist from this practice? Well, it probably gives them the feeling of power over other human beings and therefore reinforces their own self-esteem. Still, I would have expected these young leaders to discontinue this shameful practice. But I forget. Shame and disgrace don't bother politicians. As long as it provides or confirms their power over the destiny of their constituents, this pratha will continue. I remember that scene from Bahubali when the elderly slave Katappa takes Bahubali's foot and places it on his own head as a pledge of loyalty and servitude. Many of my friends thought that that was one of the most iconic and dramatic sequences in the movie. But I was sickened by it. I think it is a depiction of one of India's ugliest feudal practices. There is nothing noble about it. What Katappa did in a presumably period movie is even today done symbolically by loyal supporters who don't hesitate to fall and prostrate themselves at a politician's feet. What is lacking in a human being that is willing to give up every iota of self-respect and grovel like that? But then, what is lacking in a human being that makes him expect and welcome such groveling and feels good about it? Like I said, the open display of servitude adds to their own self-esteem while showing the public who the boss is. Speaking of Katappa brings me to our great cinema industry. There are many things offensive in our films, but here is one that I find most obnoxious. This is the scene where a married woman dutifully touches the feet of her husband. I hate those scenes. The bowed head and the pious look on the woman's face, the expression of benign magnanimity on the man's face, the righteous background music, and the general feeling of virtue all around. At home, I usually gnash my teeth and swear at the TV, and if I could, I would personally thrash everybody involved in creating such scenes. I know it is a prevailing tradition even today in our society, and it is one of the most disgusting and hateful rituals in our culture, and one of the most offensive and disrespectful to women. There is one more tradition that is peculiar to India, and that is the use of flower garlands at places of worship and at events to honor guests. I wonder if this practice prevails in other cultures. Flower offerings to gods are common in temples, mosques, and gurudwaras, and has been the tradition in India since the earliest times. It is taken for granted, and nobody even pauses to think about this practice. It is estimated that about 800 to 1,000 tons of flowers are offered in India annually. In 2018, India imported flowers worth 1.5 billion rupees. Of course, offering flowers, floral garlands, and food as a form of worship in temples is one thing. Spending lakhs of rupees on floral garlands for politicians is quite another. I am not talking of lakhs of rupees for many garlands. This is actually the price of each garland. These days, garlands for politicians are just not made of flowers. They are made of fruits like apples and dry fruits like almonds, walnuts, and raisins. There are garlands that are around 14 feet in length. They weigh over 300 kilos. They are created by dozens of workers who work over many days. And these garlands need to be transported by truck and lifted by cranes. They cost more than a couple of lakhs each. Politicians compete with each other to make the most unusual and exotic garlands for their mentors. Even the gods seldom get these kind of garlands. I wonder how much each political party spends on these garlands and where these funds come from. Obviously from political donations. And think of the waste. India generates over 20 lakh tons of floral waste every day. There are thousands of political events held across the country daily. I would say a good amount of that waste comes from these events. Some floral waste management companies have popped up to make products like incense sticks and perfumes from this waste. But this is still a tiny bit of the total waste. Do you know where the rest of the floral waste goes? Well, into our beloved holy rivers like the Ganges. Well, one could well say, thank God they are spending it on flowers and fruits. Otherwise, God alone knows what nefarious activities these funds could be used for. I also think of what they do with these fruit garlands once the event is over. Well, I hope the apples and oranges and pomegranates are distributed among the poor. Even then, it is a bit like Queen Mary Antoinette saying, if they don't have food, let them have apples. But what happens to the walnuts and the almonds and the raisins? It would be nice to find out, really. Surely they will not feed the poor dry fruits. That would put the queen to shame. Usually the prasad that is offered to the gods is then distributed among the devotees and sometimes given to the poor. Our politicians probably think they are not less than gods, since the fruit garland offered to them is then donated to the poor. I assure you that if I ever become a politician, my first order of the day will be to prohibit people from touching my feet and garlanding me. When I mentioned this to a friend, he laughed at me. He told me that in India, you should always demand such respect and enforce it ruthlessly. If you stop people from bending to touch your feet, he said, you can be sure they will start climbing onto your head. That's what he told me. Of course, that day will never come, for I will never become a politician. That too is a dubious honor that I am not qualified for. Thank you, and see you again soon.